episode 19. In the previous episode, we had covered chapter 2, and with that, we have now covered 119 verses which are there in chapters 1 and 2. There are a total of 700 verses in the Gita, and if you exclude chapters 14 to 17, which I am not very interested in, the remaining chapters have a total of 600 verses. Therefore, we have now covered almost 20% of the total verses that I find relevant. Also, we have covered chapter 2, which is the most important chapter of the Gita. Let me tell you an interesting story about Mahatma Gandhi, who also wrote his interpretation of the Gita. Mahatma Gandhi said that the Gita is not only my Bible and my Quran, it is more than that. It is my mother. He was a big follower of the Gita. He mentions that during difficult times in his life, he repeatedly went to the Gita to search for a verse, and inevitably he would find one that would put a smile on his face and give him the spirit to fight. I've also read that Gandhiji knew a few verses of chapter 2 by heart, which used to inspire him the most. So he also was very influenced by chapter 2. Let's do a quick recap of chapter 2 today, given that it's such an important part of the overall Songs of the Lord or Bhagavad Gita. This chapter can be classified into 4 parts. In the first part, Arjuna pleads with God and asks him to guide or instruct him as he is confused about which path to take. Then God answers him in 3 parts. The first being the eternal soul or Dehina, which is everlasting and immortal. God says the soul will always exist. It doesn't die. And it cannot kill anyone. So it doesn't make any sense to grieve for killing the Kauravas in the battlefield. Next, God speaks about one's righteous battle. He further elaborates that your rightful duty is to fight this battle. Lastly, God talks about the self-realized Sthit Pragya and the qualities of the one whose wisdom is established. So we covered all of this in chapter 2. Now we will recap some of the important learnings. First, the words that God uses for the soul or Dehina are all-permeating, unborn, undying, imperishable, everlasting, eternal, undiminishing, immeasurable, unchangeable, immutable, unmanifested, imponderable, ever calm, immovable, uncleavable, unwettable, can't be dried, can't be burnt, can't be killed. I mentioned that although he never mentions himself while saying these words, these are actually the same words that are used to describe God. In some ways, while describing the eternal soul or Dehina, God says that the soul is a part of me. So that's one thing which we have talked about. Second, I talked about verse 12, wherein he says, Na tu ev aham jatu, na asam, na tvam, na ime janadhipah, na cha ev, na bhavishyama, sarve vayamtah param. God says, never was there a time when I did not exist, nor you, nor all of these kings. Nor in the future shall any of us cease to be. All of us are here forever. He says everyone is always there, which is one of the most important sayings of chapter 2. The next set of things we talked about was the analogy of waves. Paramahansa Yogananda talks about the birth and death of waves, wherein he explains that just as waves are born on top of the ocean and cease to exist once they hit the shore, similarly, humans are born and die. But these waves are eternally a part of the ocean, just as soul is the part of the infinite and is forever. It doesn't make sense to grieve for the waves. Similarly, why grieve for humans who die? This interpretation leads then to the question on whether reincarnation happens or not. We discussed this in verses 13, 22, 27 and 28. In verse 13, God says, Dehino asmin yatha dehe kaumaram yauvanam jara tatha dehantar prapti dhira tatra na muhyati. God says, just as the embodied soul or Dehina passes from childhood to youth, to old age, similarly, at the time of death, the soul ceases to be in a body. I mentioned that my interpretation is dehanta, or end of body, and not dehantar, move to another body. Then we talked about verse 2.22, where God says, Vasansi jirnani yatha vihai, navani grihnati naro aparani, tatha sharirani vihai jirnani, anyani sanyati navani dehi. This means that just as we fold old clothes and buy new ones, similarly, there is a change of body for the soul as well. This leads to whether reincarnation happens or not. Does it happen that upon dying, your soul moves into a new body? This is where I had said that I don't follow the logic of assembly line production. While it is true that one who dies will be born again and one who is born will die, which is also mentioned by God in verse 27, but equally, everything is unmanifested in the beginning and at the end. It's manifested only in the middle. We don't know the manifestation or the form it will be recreated in after death. I don't understand the concept of assembly line production, which is what I keep saying again and again. If you remember, I had said that the waves account for only 8% of the water in the ocean, as a larger part of the water in the ocean moves actually through underwater currents. So, if a wave breaks, no one knows when a new wave will be formed. Neither will anyone know if indeed a new wave was formed or if it took the form of an underwater current. And even if a new wave was born, it is a new wave from the ocean. It is not that the old wave which died has been reborn or reincarnated or recreated. It is difficult to determine the form that the wave takes a new birth in, because the old one has died and there's a new one which has got created. Both are part of the ocean. For example, water combines with carbon dioxide to form glucose and then goes back to its original shape after getting eaten and disintegrates into water and carbon dioxide. So water and carbon dioxide have been created again, but it's not the same water and carbon dioxide which was born. I had therefore said dehanta, end of body, is my interpretation, and I don't buy the logic of the spirit retaining its identity after death, carrying karma along with it, and then being reborn with the effects of the past karma. Again, if you look at the human population on earth, around the year 1300 to 1400, it was approximately 300 million people, which is now over 7.5 billion people. So what happened to the dehina or soul? Did each soul get splintered into nearly 25 parts? What really happened? My view, therefore, is that once a wave breaks, it becomes one with the ocean. It doesn't have any existence of its own. If a new wave is formed, it's a new wave. It's part of the same ocean. And the same holds true for body and soul. On death, the body ends, the soul merges with the spirit, and when a new body is given to the soul, that's a new body and it's a new person. Then verse 2.31 to 2.53 are important verses wherein God talks about the righteous battle and says, you don't have to search for the righteous battle or your rightful duty, as it is staring you in your face. If you remember, in verse 2.31 he says, Swadharmam api cha aveksha na vikampitum arhasi, dharmayat hi yuddhat shreya anyat kshatriyasya na vidyate. There is no better engagement than fighting this battle that is staring you in the face. This means that you should not tremble or get scared by your righteous battle. Instead, you should fight it. I had said that apart from warriors, this is also applicable to a student, a householder, a parent, a businessman, actually anyone. It is also applicable to the internal righteous battle that you may be involved in, not just the external battle. And again, you don't have to search for this battle. It is right there in front of you and will always remain through the course of your life. In verse 33, God says, At chet tvam imam dharmayam sangramam na karishyasi tatah swadharmam kirtim cha hitva papam avapsasi. God says, if however you refuse to fight this righteous battle, you will ruin your name and reputation, and you will certainly incur sin. So your objective is to fight this righteous battle. Please remember that karma is not without objective. Hence this battle has to be fought. Hato va prapyasisi swargam jitva va bhokshase mahim tasmat uttishth kaunteya yuddhai kritnishchaya. If you win this battle, you will enjoy the kingdom on earth. But if you get slain on the battlefield, then you will attain heaven. Therefore, rise, Arjuna, fight with determination. In other words, you get the strength to struggle. You get the learnings from the defeat, which makes you a much better fighter for the next battle, which is to be fought the next day. It is never a waste. So this is what God says in verse 37. And then in verses 47 to 53, God reiterated several principles, such as action is better than inaction, and you have no right over the fruits of action. Karmanye vadhikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana ma karm phalhetur bhu mate sango astavi karmani. This is verse 2.47. He says, never be attached to inaction. Action is always better. God further says, action done along with yoga is better than one done without it. And then he also says, if you follow this advice, you will attain everlasting peace, Shashvat Shanti. In verse 49, God says, Duren hi avaram karma buddhi yogat dhananjaya buddhau sharanam anvich kripana falhetava. This means that karma done with buddhi and yoga is much better than any karma done without these. Hence, seek refuge in knowledge or rational discrimination and yoga, and free yourself from any kind of attachment. So action needs to have objective and rational discrimination. And then we said action has to be performed with skill. In verse 50, God mentions yoga karmasu kaushalam, that is, yoga is skill in action. So action has to be done with objective, with perseverance, with rational discrimination, and with skill. You also need to be aware that while in action, you should not get attached to the fruits of your action, because you don't have any right over these fruits. Also, you cannot focus on your action or karma unless you have control over your senses. And even if you become a recipient of the fruits of your action, do not consider yourself to be the cause of it. You are a contributor, not a cause. So these are some of the essential learnings of chapter 2 that I have quickly recapped. There are a few things that I find important to tell you. First, whatever we have discussed till now comes a lot from Paramahansa Yogananda. I may agree or disagree with certain things, but I'm influenced a lot by his interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita. However, till now, I have not mentioned Kriya Yoga anywhere. Yogananda was actually a big proponent of Kriya Yoga, which is the act of attaining God by doing pranayam, breath control, meditation, and focusing on your inner body. Paramahansa Yogananda talks about it a lot and in detail. But I did not cover it because I don't know pranayam, and this interpretation, in my view, is often ascetic. Second, Yogananda also frequently compares Lord Krishna to Jesus Christ. He also wrote that just as Lord Krishna is for Eastern civilization, Jesus Christ is for the Western one. He compares them a lot and he finds similarities in both of them. So you should also be aware of this. Next, I want to talk about two more things. In chapter 2, there are at least two instances that talk about what happens after death. I think in particular, verse 72 is the one to look at. Esha Brahmi Sthiti Parth Na Enam Prapya Vimuhyati Sthitva Asyam Antakale Api Brahma Nirvanam Richati. God says, such is the state of an enlightened soul with nirvana, that having attained it, one is never again bewildered, confused, or deluded. What does attaining nirvana mean? We talk about the battles that we have been fighting daily. So what does attaining nirvana after death mean? This is a question that should arise because I have argued that after death, everything gets immersed into God. By the way, Paramahansa Yogananda also quotes that death means a lot of different things in Sanatana Dharma. In some places, you will see written that each breath is life and death. In some places, you will see written every dream cycle is life and death. So there are many interpretations. My interpretation is that whenever the Sanjay inside you does an impartial introspection, that is life and death. Or when you are fighting the righteous battle, that is life and death. Victory in this battle is always bitter. But even if you lose, you gain strength from the struggle, learn from the failures, and carry it to the battle you have to fight the next day. And when you achieve the state of nirvana, then you remain in it, irrespective of the fact that it's an external battle or internal. For me, the interpretation of death in the Bhagavad Gita is about every introspection cycle done by your inner Sanjay, or every righteous battle that you're fighting in. Once the battle reaches its end time, then a new battle starts. If you attain nirvana, then you continue further battles in the same state of bliss. This bliss is the same peace that reflects in the face of Christ or Guru Nanak or Lord Buddha and is forever. If you carry in this Brahma state, you carry it with all your internal and external battles having attained nirvana. I can't talk about nirvana after death because I don't know what happens after death. And as far as I am concerned, after death, the soul immerses itself in the spirit. That's it. So that's one thing which I wanted to say. The next thing is that when we begin chapter 3 is Karma Yoga. And then chapter 4, 5 and 6 go into parts where God talks about knowledge, renunciation, etc. And then from chapter 7 onwards, he starts talking about himself. You will notice a lot of repetitions in the coming chapters, some of which will be repetitive from what you have heard in chapter 2. Sometimes the language becomes confusing as you read the subsequent chapters. For correct interpretation, it is very important to refer back to chapter 2 to establish coherence. You have to remember this. For example, in subsequent chapters, God says, "Give all your deeds to me and you will attain the state of actionlessness." This means that you have reached the state where you're doing action for the pleasure of action, or because you have excelled in that, or because it is your righteous battle that you are fighting. The interpretation is that you have detached yourself from the fruits of the action. God, however, clearly says, do not indulge in inaction. So, if by reading the later chapters, you start believing that you should attain the state of inaction, then you have missed the point. Chapter 2 clearly states, never lend thyself to inaction. Similarly, God didn't talk about worshipping him in all of chapter 2. However, he talks about it in later chapters. At one point, he says, greet me and worship me. But in chapter 2, he says that the path to God is through karma, jnana and dhyana. Worship is through these paths to God and not merely by praying or performing yajnas. So I think it is always important to remember that chapter 2 is the North Star. Taken out of context, later chapters can be confusing and can be misused. And if you don't have the right context of chapter 2, then you will get lost in the Gita. This is where I'll stop today. I hope you found the discussion interesting. Thank you.